Hey guys, and welcome back to exercise 3 of Steps Grow Your Creativity. Now, if you are new to this course and you haven't seen any of the previous videos, I will give a brief overview so that you know what you're dealing with. Essentially, Steps is supposed to be a course to help you grow your creativity and learn methods of idea generation through a series of exercises that will be assigned to you in this series of videos. Now, in this exercise, none of the other previous exercises will be required. However, in exercise 4, both exercise 1 and exercise 3 would be preferable. So if you're worried about catching up, now would probably be the time to do that. If not, when exercise 4 comes around, you can simply go back and do specifically 1 and 3 and be good to go. So now that we have those basics out of the way, let's move on to today's exercise. So in a similar vein to the previous 2 exercises of this series, exercise 3 will also be fairly simple to complete. Essentially, today's exercise is simply to make a wide variety of different patterned / painted papers, and we will be using these quite frequently in future videos in this series. Because of the frequency in which we will be using these papers, I would recommend that you make at least 20, but if you feel inclined to create more than that, feel free. Now, a big thing about creating these painted papers is that I want you to use the cheapest paper you have. I assume this will be printer paper, but if somehow you found paper cheaper than that, use that. Scratch paper or envelopes might be fun, though in this video, what I'm doing is exclusively printer paper. And the reasoning behind this cheap paper is that I don't want you to become intimidated by the idea of ruining something. I personally love using paper like this that's so inexpensive, it's borderline scary, because it's very good for experimentation. Another thing I would recommend is putting a piece of paper down behind the pages that you're painting. If you have a super large sheet like I have laid down on my desk, that would really be preferable. But if all you have is printer paper, you can simply place the piece you're working on off the edge of it and then scrape. This allows you to get right up to the edge of the paper if that's something that you desire. It lets you clean off leftover paint that might be on your brushes, or if you use a pencil in wet paint and you get paint on your pencil, you can clean it off. And essentially what we're doing is creating more paper while we're working on paper. I do have plans to use these scratch papers in some future videos in this series, so when you're working on your artwork, feel free to keep a stack of papers of this nature. Now, thus far, I've really only talked about painting these types of papers, though there are other ways you can create them as well. My personal preference is acrylic. They dry much faster than watercolors, and it's easier to layer, especially when your acrylics are opaque. However, if all you have is a Crayola watercolor palette, that's perfectly acceptable as well, and will work perfectly for what we're trying to do here. About half of the papers that I create in this video were done using watercolor, and the other half were done using acrylics. But even though I tend to use paints to create these patterned papers, if you don't have paints, it is possible to use other items. You can use crayons, you can use just graphite pencils if that's all you have. Just try to create patterns. However, if you do have like $2 to spare, I would recommend getting a Crayola or even cheaper, a store brand palette of 8 watercolors. It will come in handy. And if you feel weird about using cheap watercolors, just keep in mind that the watercolors I used for this video was a $5 watercolor palette that I bought at Michael's. They're not the most expensive, most fancy watercolors, but for this type of project, they do the job and they do it well. If you do decide to use acrylics for these papers, if you just have some lying around your house, or you decided to go out and get some little 70-cent bottles of acrylic, there are a few techniques that I tend to use repeatedly on these types of papers. I really enjoy applying paint with an old credit card, or in this case, I believe it was a gift card. Simply squirt the paint onto your paper and scrape it around. You can also use a paintbrush or a stencil with a sponge. And when it really comes down to the execution of this exercise, I really encourage you to simply put on some music that you love and just let it flow. Don't think too hard about it. Don't try to make it be anything. Just let your hand move across the paper and let the paint or whatever else you're using do what it will. And I know for me, this can be a very difficult process because I'm very perfectionistic when it comes to my artwork. But that's sort of the point of this series of videos. It's to help you relax with your art. It's to help you find new ways of being creative that aren't quite as stressful. So as difficult as it can be to not try to make it perfect, do your best. And the obvious side effect of letting the marks flow and not really being perfectionistic about it is that you will have some papers that you like and some that you don't. However, there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, I actually have a video planned for later in this series where we will be using some of the papers we aren't a big fan of. So don't be discouraged, don't throw them away, just set them aside and work on some more. Overall, the point of this exercise is to help you understand that it's acceptable for things to not always work. If you feel like doing something, if you feel like letting your hand move a certain way, and you have fun doing it, then you've succeeded. You haven't failed, even if the result is not what you imagined in your head. As long as you're enjoying putting the marks on the paper, you won. Personally, I find that after about 20 minutes of doing something like this, I really get into the flow and I never want to stop. If you find that you've already created your 20 papers and you're in the flow and you want to keep going, please do. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there is no such thing as having too many of these papers, especially because the next exercise will be using 10 of them. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching me create these papers and that the tips I gave were helpful to you. Once you've completed your exercise, you can share it with us in the Facebook group, which will be linked below, or you can use the hashtag StepsCreative on Instagram if you would prefer to share there. Thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.